I'd like to welcome you all to the final week of our webinar series on engaging with children and youth. This week we are we're focusing on engagement with youth. It was supposed to be 2 more weeks, but honestly, I feel that we are all, it's mid-June. Everybody's energy is waning, so I just thought let's just leave this on a high note. We have a really interesting presenter today. I have some great questions for her. You are also able to ask questions. We're going to use the chat function for that. I also have Madden, who is my co-host today, who's going to be, helping out with any of the stuff that needs to be dealt with in terms of like digital anything. So use the chat. If you have questions that come up, just put them in there, and then we'll be stopping periodically to look at the chat and get feedback. And I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. I just want to thank you for your time this morning. I know how precious our time is this time of year in particular. So let's make the absolute most of this time together, and let's just dive in. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Hilary Bogert-Winkler. It's a lot of names. And I will ask you to please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so she said I'm Hilary Bogert-Winkler. I am the Director of Pastoral Studies at Montreal Diocesan Theological College, where I know a couple of you folks from. And before that, I was the Diocesan Youth Missioner for the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts. And before that, I was the Priest Associate for Youth and Young Adults at Grace Episcopal Church in Amherst. So and before that, I was working at summer camps and doing all that kind of stuff. So I've been doing youth ministry really since I was a youth. But for my entire ordained career, I've been involved with youth ministry. And actually this year is probably the year I've been involved kind of the least, because I'm not officially in a parish and I'm doing this. But I've done some kind of consulting work since then and work with some national stuff. So this summer I was supposed to be at the Episcopal Youth event in Baltimore, helping being part of the pastoral care team for that, but that got moved to next summer. So hopefully next summer I'll be there. I love the cats walking across because mine do the same.
I've got a lot too.
So that's and so when I say youth, I primarily mean young people who are in I'm used to thinking of it as grades 6 to 12, so that's about age 11 or so until 18. I think the needs and concerns for kids younger are different, and the needs for young adults are definitely different. So and even within that range, the middle school kids need different things than the high school kids, but we tend to think about them programmatically in one big thing. So that's kind of my youth experience. I'm also I teach Anglican history and preaching and all that kind of stuff. So I have a PhD in history, and so do that as well. But doesn't usually come into my youth work too much.
Awesome, thank you for that your impressive introduction. So we have, our first week we talked about an overview of like children and youth, and mostly kind of managing this new way of digital engagement, and then we've just been talking about things more and more. And as I said, this week we are going to be focusing on youth in particular. So Hilary, what makes connecting with youth unique as we consider them in relation to children and older adults? You touched on that in your introduction.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about this as I brushed my teeth this morning about kind of how to articulate, because I think, and I think this plays into this particular moment as well. But just in general, youth are in this kind of weird position where they're not kids, but they are kids. And as they get, especially above about 16, like they're not adults, but they're kind of becoming adults. And so it's this very liminal space where they're in between, and they're not fully one and they're not fully the other. And they tend to get treated as one or the other and not both and that can be, and they tend to want to be treated as one or the other and not both and. And so it can be hard to navigate that, because, with children, it's very clear that they're children, and they can't do these things, and they can't. And even like when my newly 4-year-old was 3, right, there was the 3-nager idea that they're like they want to do things independently, but they still need some support. But it's really it's that kind of thing, but writ large. Like you have 15, 16, like especially once they start driving, like I can go out and I can get places on my own, and I can have a job, and I can do all of these things. And like, I'm an adult, I want to do this, but they still need the boundaries that adults can set, and they still need the love and support in ways that are different once you're kind of 21, 22. So we're walking with them in this very kind of weird moment where they're both kids and figuring out adults and figuring out who they are, and differentiating themselves from their families and from their parents in kind of more extreme ways than they do when they're little. But then you also can't do the things they do, like when they're adults, and say, well, you're a grown up, you should have this figured out. It's like, I don't know, they're 16, 17. They don't have that figured out. And so how do we walk them through this and figure that out together? So I think that's the joy and the challenge of doing youth ministry, is figuring out how to walk that space with them. Particularly when we're not necessarily in that space anymore, right? Like hopefully we've kind of figured our stuff out a little bit more, and we're still, I may be 37, but I don't feel like a grown up most of the time. I still feel, 18 or 25. But I'm not that 17-year-old, 16-year-old quite the same way. And so I often have to find myself trying to remind myself of what that was like. Oh, right. What was that like? It was, walking down the street the other day, I had this realization of, and I called my sister. So I'm the oldest of three, and we're within 3 years of each other. So when I was a senior in high school, my sister was a junior and my brother was a freshman, and we're all pretty close now. My sister's one of my best friends, but we were not in high school. And I just had this realization of, like, if this had happened when I was in high school, I would be stuck at home with my brother and sister for months. And it was just this moment of, like, I knew teenagers were having a hard time, but it was just that reminder of, oh my gosh, like, right, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to, have that space. It would have just been, my siblings and I on top of each other all the time, all day, every day, day after day. And so I think we have to constantly kind of remind ourselves of what it was. And being a teenager now is not exactly like it was when I was a teenager, but it's also not that different in a lot of ways. Facebook didn't come out until I was in college, but there's still, like, stuff that the teens I've worked with are dealing with are still very much the same, right? The pressure is to know what you're going to do for the rest of your life by the time you're 18. The heartbreak of, falling in love for the first time and falling out of love for the first time. And, that still exists, even if it's not happening over text, right? Like, so we can make those connections that way. But yeah, trying to figure out that weird path, that tightrope between adulthood and childhood, is what makes this period so unique.
Okay, thank you. I just want to welcome Jessica and Brian. So you guys are free to use the chat for any comments or questions as we go. We are, of course, speaking with Dr. Hilary Bogert-Winkler today about engaging with youth online. So Hilary, you actually just articulated something for me that provided a lot of clarity in terms of my own experience with youth ministry. So I used to run a program with, like, literally 20 kids, like a youth ministry program at St. Thomas Church, NDG. There were 20 kids, and of all ages. And I was always somebody who really advocated for, like, the intergenerational ministry thing, because it really worked in that context. And I think I was really always having trouble explaining, what is it? And I think it's because the teens because they were in that liminal space, right? They were not quite adults, but they were having an opportunity to mentor the younger children, to still kind of let their own inner child kind of come to life through some of the activities that they could help the younger kids with, but still assume their more mature aspect because they were in a mentorship role. So it was really healthy. And one of the things we talked about in the first week was that I feel like this platform reduces that opportunity, so that kids can't actually say, oh, let me help you with that. And I think it really becomes a bit more like, I think we really do, I think we need to, unfortunately, engage more specifically with the age groups on here, because we don't have that opportunity for connection in the same way. So thanks for saying that. I don't know if anybody else has anything to comment about, if that resonates or your experience around that.
Well, I think
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna read the chat out.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what Donna said in the chat box, I thought was.
Yeah, like she's saying, like, the big challenge is how to walk that space with them virtually, and that right now, falling in love and not being able to see that person in person.
Right.
I'm assuming you're going to cover that in your conversation. So I just kind of popped that in there, though, just to say, okay, those are some of the things on my mind when I came on here. So, and as you spoke about them, I just wanted to pop them in there. But please continue.
Okay. We're good. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm trying to take a few notes, and I'll put also a few notes after our meeting up on Facebook. All right, so let's speak a little bit about, and all of us can look at this question for ourselves as well. Tell us about, Hilary, how you have been navigating this pandemic in terms of engaging with youth online for the purposes of ministry, and what have you observed? So are there any learnings that you can share with us? And of course, learnings from the group as well at this point could be a helpful contribution to the chat. We'll start with Hilary.
Yeah, so a couple of things have stood out for me. The first is that I noticed. So we live out in Point Claire, so it's more of a suburban area, and so we're out and about a lot, and you don't see a lot of groups of people outside of family groups. But when I've seen groups of people who are kind of technically breaking the rules, it's always teenagers. And that isn't me saying like, oh, kids these days, they don't know how to follow the rules. I think it's just because, there is such a need for peer groups amongst that age group, especially. Like I know my 4-year-old just went back to school this week, and it's been night and day for him in kind of how he is right now that he's back with his peers. But I think with these young people, it's even like, it's so drastically different. Like they need their peer groups. And so there's just this kind of like, I need this, and so I'm going to go out and do it. Like, I'm not going to call anybody on them because, that's A, the police need to be doing other things, and B, they need these groups, right? It's that kind of risk assessment. So I think that navigating ministry virtually with youth right now is understanding that that's this kind of underlying loss, right? That's the grief, is that this peer group has been lost, because the reality is Zoom is not the same as sitting in a room with your friends, right? Zoom is performative in a certain way. And that's why, going to 3 hours of Zoom meetings is exhausting in a different way than 3 hours of in-person meetings. Like you may be able to sit there in shorts and sandals with your fancy t-shirt on, but you're also kind of performing for a camera in ways that you don't when you're in person. And so that's the kind of first thing is I think that's the biggest loss that we're having, is that for these young people, they've lost the ability to connect with one another in person and just be. And just think about the teenagers and how they are physically with one another, right? There's like, not all of them are, right? I have lots of teens who are not touchers. They don't want people touching them. But then you've got lots of teens who are like sit on each other's laps, or they hug each other all the time, or they're just kind of, it's like a pile of teenagers in a youth room. And that's because this physical connection is so important for so many of them. And so we have that grief. But I think when it comes to kind of doing ministry with youth, but I think this was really ministry with anybody online, is that the best things I've seen are when they're based on principles. So instead of coming up with a list of like, these are your, things you should do and things you shouldn't do, right? Like, do this Bible study, don't do this thing. It's rather think of a set of guiding principles to guide, and questions to guide how you approach ministry, and then to create things around those principles, whatever they are, right? So it could be that your principle is, all right, we've lost the ability to connect physically. And like our youth program used to be built around, say, like Wednesday evening or Sunday morning Bible study, Wednesday evening fellowship time, and I don't know, a couple times a month on a Friday, you'd go like to movies or bowling or whatever. Like, think about what your youth program did and what all of those different things did for your youth, and kind of draw principles out from that, right? So, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be seeking to keep youth connected to one another in some way, because this is a very isolating time. We spend all our time at home if you're able to work from home. And if you're not able to work from home, right, if you're a family where somebody has to work outside of the home, that's bringing its own kind of risks and things that they have to juggle. So the youth may be even more isolated because their parent like works in a hospital or a grocery store, or is a postal worker. And so, they're like, oh, okay, I definitely can't go out and do things because I have to stay here. So we think of things like at the college, when we've been talking about community life for the coming semester, right? So the semester is going to be online. So when we've been talking about how do we plan for community life, we start with a set of questions, right? Like, how much of this is something that we can replicate virtually? How much of it is not what we can replicate virtually? And what is it that we try to do in those community life settings? And how can we do that online? So I think it's kind of like thinking about people have been thinking about their youth programs and kind of reducing it to kind of basic, right? Like we do Bible study on Sunday morning so that we can connect our young people to the word, right? Like the foundation of youth ministry is, connecting our young people to Jesus, right? That's what sets us apart from, the school drama club or whatever, is that we're really building this on a foundation of Christ. And so we do on Sunday morning to connect them to the word, and our Friday evenings are so that they get a chance to fellowship with one another in a community that's committed to loving each other no matter what, right? And, our Wednesday evening dinner time is when we're able to focus on community building in different ways. So you think, well, how can we build community online? How can we connect them to the word in new ways? And the other thing is, I think we're moving to a space, at least right now, where you maybe don't have to do every single thing virtually, right? Like we're now at the space, at least in Quebec, where you can gather 10 people from 3 families as long as you distance. So are there opportunities in your youth group for small group ministry in different ways, right? Can you gather with a couple of families of kids and maybe there's 6 of you at a park and you're sitting distance, right? Teenagers can do physical distancing in the ways that like 4-year-olds can't. So how can you take advantage of that to create these spaces for them that happen? So it doesn't necessarily all have to be digital, right? You can be creative, you can work with what you've got. And also thinking about equity, right? Like for the people who can't attend anything that we do physically, can we provide an online option for them to opt in? How do we do that? So a lot of what I've seen and what I've been doing is thinking about principles and working from there, because what works for one youth group isn't going to work for another youth group in terms of specifics. So when we think broadly about big things, then people can say, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that as being something we can do. So hopefully that answer. It's kind of a big non-answer answer.
That's awesome, actually. Again, it has gotten me thinking about another one of the concerns we've addressed is that part of our role in youth ministry is we're not just implementers. We're also administrators. We have to do the inviting. And so when we are in the invitation process, we talked about how our event actually begins with the invitation, because if we want people to come, we have to make a really compelling argument for them to come, because we know, first of all, there's so much digital stuff for them to do. And second of all, church is often 1,000 on the list of priorities, in our culture. So we have to be really, really, really intentional about the invitation process. So I think the idea of considering those guiding principles when we talk about the process of invitation can really be helpful with youth, because that, of course, as you pointed out, is important for effective programming. I'd love to hear from anybody else in terms of what your learnings have been with youth as you've been, in the past, 12, 13 weeks now. Can anybody share any? You can write it in the chat, or feel free to just launch in with what you've observed and your learnings. Does that mean you guys just don't want to share? That's fine. That's fine. I can't share on that because I actually haven't been doing youth ministry now for some time. I just don't do it. I've been observing, as I've shared with you guys, my wife is a kindergarten teacher, and so today they're doing their graduation. It's like so sad. I can't even tell you. Like, these kids are like, my favorite memory from kindergarten was playing with my friends. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to die, because they can't play with their friends right now. So I know what's happening for sure in terms of, I really, really been paying close attention to what's happening with kids, but I don't know, like I'm sure that the youth are like totally burnt out on here as well. And probably, I don't know. I'd love to know what your experience has been, but.
I've seen a lot of, I was thinking, so like I have kind of 4 big principles of youth ministry in general, like not virtual, but just like that guide my ministry. And they're listen, don't fix, be authentic. It's a ministry of presence, and boundaries are key. And I was thinking today about the listen, don't fix part, because I think there's a lot of anger from a lot of youth I've seen about, and a lot of grief about this, because
Again, listen.
yeah, I can put them in the chat box
Yeah, that'd
actually.
be great. Thanks. Yeah.
So it's interesting too, ministry of presence, because we're in this kind of odd place where presence is different than it was, and online presence is not the same. And I mean, this is the heart of the virtual Eucharist debate. Is I mean, we're an incarnational faith, right? Which is about like bodies are important and physical presence is important, and how does that play into all of this? And so, you know, I think what I've seen from a lot of young people is a lot of grief and anger about this, because, you know, what is normal to them, what they're expecting has been taken away. And we all know that like stability is really, really good for young people. It's good for children, and it's also good for youth, whether or not they're willing to admit that. And part of that stability is just what expectations are and norms, because everything else in them is changing, right? Like they're changing kind of physically, their brain chemistry is changing, their hormones are going crazy. And so everything about their kind of personhood is so uncertain that being able to depend on, all right, like school goes until this date, and then I'm gonna, you know, work at camp, or I'm gonna work at this fast food place or whatever, and then I'm gonna go to school. Or it's like, I just graduated from high school and I'm gonna, you know, spend the summer at home, and then I'm gonna go to college. Or, you know, so all of these places, things that they depend on are now kind of gone, and they don't know what's necessarily coming next, and what the new norm, this new normal that is abnormal, like what is that? And I think the tendency for people who care for these young people is to want to fix that, right? To try and make that better in some ways. And this, I think, was the impetus for, I don't know if you saw it on Instagram, the like post your senior pictures or your graduation pictures type thing for all the seniors who don't get to do that, which I think came from a good place, but I'm not sure how helpful that was at the end of the day. Because it's like, look at me graduating and doing this thing that you're not going to get to do. Like, I don't know that that's a helpful thing for them to see pictures of me from my senior prom when they're not going to get to have their senior prom. And so I think really just sitting with them in that grief and that anger, and for some of them that fear, right? Like for all of our youth, home is not necessarily a safe space, like particularly for our LGBTQ youth. Like if they're not out at home, but they're out in youth group or they're out at school, that place is gone, right? Like, so now they're home all the time, and they're in this space all the time where they maybe don't get to be their authentic selves in ways that they can in youth group. And so I think helping, like understanding that is underneath all of this, and that as Donna says, right, like the mental health is not, like there's real emotional and mental trauma for everybody coming from this, right? I talk about my kids a lot just because like I've been home all the time with them for the past 3 months. But it was just remarkable to me to see, like my 1-year-old, you know, whatever, he gets to be with mom all day now, so he's happy. But the 4-year-old, like it was really, really interesting to, like, it was hard to watch, to see him, like he couldn't process that anger. And then it was coming out in weird ways and being like, all right, this is because like my super extroverted kid is at home with his family all the time. And he would say like, you know, we had to cancel his birthday, like his first big birthday party was supposed to be March 14th, and like everything shut down on March 13th. So he still talks about his birthday party that's coming up. And we're just like, I don't know when that's going to be. So like seeing him deal with that, and then like magnifying that by like 100 for these young people who are like, I'm really pissed off about this. Like, this is really, like, I'm angry about this. Like, maybe this is the time in those Bible studies to look at Job and to look at the Psalms, which are those beautiful expressions of being pissed off, right? Like, it's okay. Or like Jesus and the fig tree, right? Like there was no reason for Jesus to curse that fig tree. That fig tree was doing what that fig tree was made to do. And yet Jesus had a bad day, and that fig tree bore the brunt of it, right? Like it can be freeing for them to say like, you know what? Even Jesus had his moments, right? That was his mood that day. And so thinking about those spaces and not trying to fix it for them, because we can't fix this for them. right? Like, unless you've got a vaccine in your back pocket or a treatment, and just holding that space for them to be mad about it can be helpful. And you can think about different like creative ways, like have them do a TikTok about how pissed off they are. And you know, you don't have to, like, part of what we don't want them to just get stuck in that grief. We can also help them walk through it. You know, like, we don't stay in the valley forever. We sometimes get to the mountaintop. But yeah, so I think a big thing is just like, these kids are angry, and I'd be angry too. I mean, I am angry for different reasons, for like how my own life has been upended by this. But I keep thinking of like how hard this would have been when I was like 17, or, you know, especially like 18, especially your youth who were about to go off to like CEGEP, or who were about to start their big job, or who were going to move, right? They're like, I'm moving out of my parents' house. You know, I'm moving to Vancouver, or I'm moving to New York City. And now they're like, I'm still in my childhood bedroom. So like, just, you know, don't fix it, but yeah, like, let them be mad.
Those are epic examples. I know that my best friend recently called me because her children are my godchildren, and her oldest son is like having a really hard time. And she's like, you need to set up your game with your godson right now, because he just graduated high school and he is losing his SHIT, like legit. Like, and I was like, I don't know what to do. But I'm like, you know, as his godmother, it's my job also to give him some Christian formation. So I'll be like, you know, I'll be drawing from your examples, Hilary, because those are brilliant. So thank you.
Yeah, that's part of the be authentic part too, right? Like, I think it can help them to know that you're mad too. That it's like, I'm really upset about this, and I'm really like, in a lot of youth groups, you might do like rose and thorn type things. Like, you know, what was the rose this week? What was the thorn? And it might be like lots of thorns, like you're in a briar patch or something. Yeah. And that's okay too, right? Jesus loves us when we're mad, and God loves us when we're mad, and that we love our youth even when they're angry. That's okay too. That we're called, like, we're not called never to be mad. We're just called not to stay in that space, and to move through it in some way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really, really helpful. So, I mean, something else we've talked about over the weeks is that, you know, we're all kind of, we're all green, because we're in it's a new way of engaging. So like, nobody can say like, I'm an expert at this, because guess what? We're all new here, and we're all trying to figure out how to engage and figure out best practices. And we're wading through new territory. So this is a question for you, Hilary, but also for the group. It's a bit like the one I just asked you. You might not want to answer because you didn't answer the last one. But my question for all of you is, like, as we're trying to figure this new thing out, what are the learnings that we've gleaned in these past 13 weeks that we can share with each other around effective engagement on here? Like, what can we teach each other? I'll open the floor to you first, Hilary, and invite others to either write in the chat or to share their learnings.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest is, and you know, this has been my drumbeat for the last like 11 years when it comes to using digital tools in ministry, is like, know how to use them, right? We don't ask people to use power tools without knowing how to do it. I mean, they might, but it doesn't end well. And I think like using digital tools is the same way. You need to really know how to use it. Like, we've all at this point probably sat in a Zoom meeting with a Zoom host who didn't know what they were doing, right? Or like somebody in the room who didn't know how to mute, or who didn't know how to do this. And it just like, okay, all right, you know, let's teach you how to do this. And so it's tricky now because there are so many different tools that we can use, right? Like, and some use some and some use others. Yeah, in general, youth don't tend to be on Facebook. You might find them more on like TikTok. Do people use Snapchat anymore? I'm not even sure. I do with my kids because it distracts them. But you know, figure out, like, ask people, well, what are you guys using, and learn how to use it, and create. I mean, and this goes to the boundaries. Like, it's important, I think, as well, for effective youth ministry to be safe youth ministry. And so much of our safe church kind of policies are built around in-person presence, but we should all be having digital ministry safe church policies as well, and thinking about how to do that. And it's often I often think of it as a social media policy, but we can think of it in other ways. And so, you know, what are your personal boundaries for that, right? Like if a youth tries to connect with you on a certain platform, is that a platform that you feel is a safe place to connect with them or not? Like I don't connect with youth on Snapchat because it's so individual. And so what are the principles of safe youth ministry, right? Like we don't do one-on-one stuff. So you need to think about how do we recreate that in a digital framework? How can we prevent it from being kind of one-on-one things all the time? Because I think, teenagers often run into problems along these places because even though they all kind of conceptually know, like they intellectually know that what hits the internet stays on the internet forever, that part of the brain hasn't developed yet. And so they just do like stupid stuff that happens and then it comes out again later, right? Like you post this tweet, it doesn't matter if you delete it, somebody's gonna take a picture of it. And so it's gonna be there. And so, just thinking about like, what are the boundaries that we can set ourselves? How can we set these up in safe ways for our young people? Because again, different groups are gonna wanna use different things. And like, if you're in a youth group where not a lot of kids have smartphones, that's going to be a different kind of digital engagement than if you're in a youth group where, everybody's got an iPhone or whatever. And so just having, like, I think safety is a really key thing that doesn't get talked about in digital ministry a lot. And so just thinking about for your group, like, how do we make this a safe space? And how do I like communicate that to parents and communicate that to the church leadership so that they all know, and communicate that to the youth, right? Saying like, we may have a WhatsApp thread, but like, there's always going to be a group thread. Or, if you approach me about this pastoral matter, like if you send me a text about it, I may loop in the rector. That doesn't mean the rector's going to talk about it, but there just needs to be another pair of eyes on it. We don't sit in offices one-on-one with youth. We shouldn't sit in digital spaces one-on-one with youth either, right? Like if we're in an office with a young person, the door is open, or there's a big window, or we're meeting like at a coffee shop, right? Like we always have external eyes on it to keep us safe and to keep our youth safe. We need to think about ways to do that digitally. So I think that's really a good place to start when you're building this kind of digital ministry, because it's setting boundaries. That's one of those principles. Boundaries are important for youth and helping them know where they are, because it also helps them know where their limits of access to you are, right? Like you need to have your own space. You don't necessarily, unless it's a like pastoral emergency, you don't need to be like tweeted at midnight when you're, hanging out with your family or your significant other, or you're asleep, because apparently people sleep at night. That's what I hear. So, like you want to create those boundaries for them as well, to show them, to also show for them what healthy digital relationships can look like. Just like we try to show them in person what healthy in-person relationships look like. We can do that digitally too.
Yeah, that's great. We did talk about, we touched on that in the first week. We talked about safe church practices, but of course we don't have a policy yet in our diocese. I'm not sure if you're in the same situation, Donna, in St. John's, Ancaster, but in our diocese we haven't established an online safe church protocol, but that should be considered. So that means we have to kind of take the ones that we have and apply them on here. But we did talk about issues of like people showing up naked. I know it's even happened to, to my wife in her kindergarten class, like a child will stand up and they're wearing underwear. And she's like, okay, you need to go and put some clothes on, this kind of thing. And so, like that's an example. And also in terms of like the tech, I mean, we already have a lot of issues around digital literacy in our diocese. Like, I'm not sure if it's the same thing for you, Donna, but we have a largely older population. So getting people on here is harder just because the age demographic. So that's of course not true for everyone, because there are lots of like 95-year-olds who are way better than all of us at this stuff. But this is what I've been up against. And so getting people on here, and the first thing you do is like, just going through the basics. Like, this is how you mute, this is how you whatever, and that certainly will make for a meeting that's much better for everybody. It's just starting with the basics. I know they did that in kindergarten. They spent the first like several days. They don't use Zoom. They use Google Meets, but just talking about how to mute yourself and how to mute your video and yada yada.
And there are some cool things out there. Like Chrome has a Netflix party extension. Like at least it does in the States. I haven't tested it here, but there are ways that you can watch movies with your friends online. I have a group of friends and we play Jackbox games together online, like every Saturday night, and they're in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And we're up here, and we're able to, and it's funny because like we actually are interacting with those friends more than we did before the pandemic, because like we can't go out and do anything. So it's like, oh, hey, we'll hang out with like some of our best friends there. So, you know, you can do fun stuff with your youth if you just like do some research on what's available. Like have a Netflix party where you watch, like find something on Netflix. And if you have youth that don't have login, if you've got extra screens on your login, like, you know, share it. Like, I don't feel bad asking for you to do that for a giant corporation to lose, you know, $10 a month, or whatever. But, you know, there are extensions like this. There are ways to do Facebook watch parties where you can watch things together. You can play these games together. I mean, like, and they're ridiculous. Like our favorite game is one where you design, like you do these like t-shirt designs, and people vote on them, and it's ridiculous. Like it's the most ridiculous game, and I have no idea what the people who created it were on when they created it, but it's so much fun, right? Like it's just hilariously fun. So there are ways to do that. So you can do that. It's not always like apps. There are just ways to find these like creative things that you can do with your friends, and that I think like maybe, and it could be that your youth already know about them, right? That they're already doing watch parties on Netflix party, or, you know, they're queuing it up at the exact same time so they can all watch the same movie and talk about it, or chat about that. So what are ways that you can do that? Or can you like create a drive-in movie theater for your youth group where, you know, everybody's like, the families all come and you show it on the projector, like on the wall of, or hang up a giant sheet or whatever. Like how are ways that you can do this? So that you can make that happen.
Those are some great suggestions. Stephen has a comment. Do you want to read it, Madden? I'll admit, Brian.
Sure, yeah. So Stephen says, like, most youth in my parish participated as altar servers. With service on Zoom, they don't have the same involvement.
Yeah, and this I think speaks to a larger problem with how youth participate in church, is that they tend to be kind of siloed into particular roles. Like youth, like, and this happened to me growing up. Like I would never have been approached to be a lector or a lay Eucharistic minister. And I went to a church with a really strong youth program. And I preached a couple of times as a youth, but it's really just like Youth Sunday when we have them do this. And so now our young people have just kind of been dropped off in a lot of places on how they participate in the liturgy. And I think that's a matter of like saying to the clergy, like, hey, look, their participation and involvement is now gone. Like, how can we bring them in new ways? How can they do this? How can they, you know, start serving as lectors? Can they write the prayer? Like, can the youth group write the prayers of the people every other week or whatever? Ways to engage them in new ways, because, and to get churches out of the idea that, you know, it's when you're a kid that you're an altar server and then you get to do these things at this age and this thing at this age. Like, not necessarily. Like, it doesn't say, you know, anywhere in the Bible or the prayer book, which lots of Episcopalians or Anglicans think of as the Bible. It doesn't really make distinctions about a lot of that stuff. Like, so I think that's a really important thing. And I don't think a lot of clergy have done that intentionally. I think they're just not thinking about it because they're moving other things. So I think once it's pointed out, like, oh, hey, look, like our young people, our youth used to do this, and now this role is no longer there. What can we do to bring them back in? Like, I know many clergy that would welcome that and say, oh yeah, you know, I hadn't thought about that, but like, yeah, let's work together to get them involved again and have them be a part of our liturgical life, until we can gather again in person, whenever that's going to be, because that's a long time to like, it could be a long time that these young people are going to be not able to be in church.
Yeah, and as we know too, I mean, there's a hopeful possibility that there will be more digital church in the future as a result of all this experimentation, right? I mean, and there are certainly opportunities here that we don't have, and, you know, this isn't about that, but I do believe that many people have encountered this and said, I could use this in different ways, even if face-to-face opportunities return. But I really want to thank you for your response to that, Hilary, and for your question, Stephen, because like I also do a ministry called Supper Club, which is, people come together and have dinner, and often kids would come, and the kids really, they always had stuff to do, and they came around the table and they really enjoyed the conversation. It was not an intentional program for kids, but the kids hung out and really loved it. They don't come anymore. They're not coming. And I'm like, damn, like, what am I doing to not include the kids? Their parents are still coming, but their kids are in the other room. And I'm like, that feels like a problem for me. But I never thought of like, and again, because we're all like just desperately feeling our way in the dark here. But I really appreciate just that reminder that I could invite them to do something and that would give them more. Yeah, so there's so much to learn as we're doing this. Thank you. This is already like really helpful, Hilary.
Well, and that's the benefit too of Zoom breakout rooms. Like I know there are many churches that will have their Sunday school going in a breakout room during the main service. Now, like my older kid resists Zoom church with all of his little body. So like we've actually basically stopped church. Like I try to watch on my own on Sundays, but like as a family, we don't do church anymore because it just like he knows what he's missing and it makes him angry and sad and he just goes off the rails. And so like, and he still talks about like when I go back to church, this, and this, but like Zoom church is just not, it just doesn't work for him and for like some of these age groups. So, and I think it's also okay to create that space for young people to say like, because I'm typically a person that says Sunday morning church is important. Part of that is like, I'm clergy, so it's important for me to say that too, but it's part of our tradition that we gather as a community, and that we worship, and that this has all been kind of upended because I think for some people, digital church has been very exciting and life-giving. And for others, it's just been like painful and hard. And so like we go to church a lot less now because I just can't deal with like a 4-year-old trying to close my computer screen during the whole service. And so I think creating spaces for your young people to say like, how can we keep you connected to the church if you just can't do this like Sunday morning thing, right? If it's just too much, what spaces can we create as well? And so, I think we can create spaces for them to be part of it, but we can also not take it as a failure if they say, no, I'm not gonna do it, right? So like if it's Supper Club, you open up like, okay, I'm gonna have like a kids room, and then none of them want to come, like to be sure not to take that as a measure of like, oh, that totally failed, but just like, these kids are zoomed out and like a lot of adults are just zoomed out too. They're like, I'm so tired.
Well, it's a miracle that any of us are here this morning. So thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a time for incredible creativity and it's hard and, most good things are not easy. So we're just kind of being transformed into something new. It's a metamorphosis, but we don't know what that's going to be and what that's going to look like. But yeah, so Stephen, I think definitely bringing that up with church leadership is and if the church leadership is like offended by it, that's a different problem that they have. And hopefully that's nobody's situation.
Stephen, you got to check with yourself since you're the rector of your church.
Oh, you're the rector? All right. Well, there you go. I mean, it works out really well there.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I feel like, anyway, I'll just skip ahead to this question. So what impact do you think, Hilary, that the digital ministry will have on faith formation for our teens? Like, what is this going to do for them in the future? This is obviously you don't have a magic ball or anything, but what are your experience, your instincts? What are they telling you on this?
I can see kind of a twofold impact. One is I think it creates opportunities for continuing connection for our youth to one another. So there was a study, one of my favorite articles about youth ministry is called Sticky Faith, and it was published in the Christian Century, I think in about 2011. And the author talks about how like there was a study done that showed that most youth who went to kind of youth group in high school don't continue participation in the church after. And especially in Anglicanism, there tends to be this kind of accepted thing that like you go to church, hopefully you keep going after you're confirmed, but after you go to high school, you're going to leave the church for a while and then you're going to come back when you have kids and they need to be baptized. I don't know why this is accepted because I find this horrifying. Like we should not just be like, yes, go leave the church, go do your thing. Like you can grow and you can question and you can struggle with your faith within this larger community that kind of loves you and cares for you. And like, we're not going to say no if you leave, but we shouldn't just kind of be accepting that this is the norm. And one of the reasons the study found for that happening is that youth programs were not focused on building a relationship with Christ, which I know is very evangelical language for a bunch of Anglicans sitting in the room. And I'm from the Bible Belt, so it's like it carries its own kind of set of presuppositions. So we don't really hear that language a lot within our tradition, but that we are called to build like relationships with Christ both individually and as a community. Like it's not either or, it's both and. And so the youth that tended to go to college programs or who went to church after they finished high school were the youth whose high school programs really focused on faith formation, and it wasn't just social gatherings. So I think what this has the ability to do as well is that because we're getting used to connecting digitally and doing these check-ins and making that, is that being able to maintain that with our youth, like even after they graduate, right? Like to connect with them and to keep up those relationships, because we're learning what keeping relationship like that happen, like what it looks like digitally. On the other hand, I do think that this is I think this whole experience, and not just for youth, but for everybody, is really showing how much we need one another, like just in person. It's both giving us, I think, a greater awareness of the people in our communities who can't join physically constantly and who haven't been able to beforehand, right? Like people who have different medical conditions who like just can't be amongst lots of people. It's alerted us to that. It's also alerted us to like how much that physical presence means to us, right? Like church has just always been a part of my life. And when I was watching a church service, like on Easter, I was watching the National Cathedral's service and I'm just sitting there like weeping. And I'm not a crier at church. Like I could cry easily, but church is not a place that I cry. And I'm just like, it had never occurred to me just how much I missed it until I couldn't be there. And so I think we might see youth really being willing to engage in person more because they've actually realized what it was like when they just can't, like when it's not even a choice. Like, well, I decided I was going to go to, the play with this group of friends. It was just like, no, you just don't have the ability to at all. So when like my super introvert, like I'm a super crazy extrovert and so are my kids. So this has been hard for us for that. Like I need more than just 4 people around me to be sane. But like when my super introverted husband is even like, oh my gosh, I need to be out and be amongst people. Like that's when I know that we've crossed some sort of strange Rubicon, where there's this like, I think it's gonna alert us to, how much that physical presence is important and how incarnational our faith is, and that we're gonna see that come together, which is why, I think which I think is why public health experts fear so much like opening up and everybody all of a sudden having a party with like 50 people. I mean, I've just found like the few interactions I've had with people that have had to drop something off at the house or who have stopped by and we've been like, 2 meters apart, even just how life-giving that is. Like, I don't need to hug you. I'm fine being 2 meters apart from you, but wow, like how life-giving was this moment. And so how, like, what's that going to be like when we are able to gather together for church again? Like even leaving out the Eucharist question, right? Like even leaving that out, once we're able to come together and worship as a community. And I think we'll see our youth kind of really wanting to engage with that in different ways, because they've also like that physical presence is so important. And so what's it going to be like when our beautiful, quirky, frustrating young people come together again and are actually allowed to hug each other? Like I can't even imagine what that hug is going to look like, because their hugs are usually so exuberant anyway. So what's that going to look like when they're actually can do that without fear and without like thinking, oh, I'm breaking the rules, right? Like this is allowed again. So
I just want to say something, and then I want to dive into the comments. First of all, I really, really resonated with what you said, that you can grow, question, and struggle with your faith, even when we assume that we don't. you can do that. And I don't think we are creating spaces that provide opportunities to grow, to struggle, and to question faith, because we do church in a way that says you come every Sunday and you have to, and then you open the book and you say the creed and we all have to believe all those things. So I love that idea. And I think that that's really essential. That's the bridge question between like youth ministry and like, becoming a full-blown church person. And by the way, and I'm not shy about sharing this, like I don't go to church on Sunday. I'm a Christian who doesn't feel that church does it for me. I used to totally float on my boat, and it doesn't anymore. So I resonate with that, and this is why communities like Supper Club, work for me. And I think youth groups are spaces for struggling, questioning, and just and growing, because sometimes church doesn't answer all those, tick all those boxes in my heart. So thank you for naming that. Every time you speak, Hilary, I'm just like, yes to everything. Who wants?
Again, I'm from the South. I'll roll with it. It works.
Helen has her hand up, and Lily has a comment. So. Let's maybe, Madden, would you read Lily's comment, and then we'll go to Donna.
Sure. Yeah, not a problem. So Lily says, I sometimes struggle with the faith formation piece because when I've tried, it only worked for so long. Other leaders have also shared with me that building community needs to come first where the kids feel more comfortable to share those kinds of conversations with each other. I think that as much as I want to do for the youth, it's one step at a time, especially during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the faith formation piece is hard, right? Because youth don't want to just go to Sunday school anymore. They feel they're beyond that. And so how do we do that? And we can do, I think some of it takes creativity for us to think about how do we do faith formation with them in ways that maybe are a little covert, like they don't necessarily think of it as faith formation, but it becomes that way. And so, I've heard of groups doing kind of current events every week. And so every week a different person is supposed to bring in like a news article or something. And they talk about it as a community, and that as youth leaders, we can help bring that lens of our faith to it, right? So if we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? We can talk about like, what is this about? How do they feel about this? Like, what is going on? What is their experience of seeing this movement kind of been? But also like, why is this, like, what does it mean to you that like our church has this on a banner or does not have this on a banner, right? Like, what does it mean that if you go to the Anglican Church of Canada's website, like you don't see Black Lives Matter when you get to the website? Like you got to dig a little to find any sort of statement. Like, how does that feel about you? And it's a lot of what I think this is getting them to think about the world around them in terms of their faith. So it's not necessarily we're going to do Bible study or we're going to do this, but like you can start with the world around them and then move them there. But I think that point about like community building is key to that. You have to build this circle of trust and this place of loving one another. And in some communities that's easier than others, right? If you've got a community of kids who have all grown up together, then you don't have to do quite as much of that as opposed to a community where it's maybe a bunch of kids who don't know each other as well. And how do you do that? And it's so hard with this current moment, because I think so much of what we were doing was kind of triage, right? Like all of a sudden everything shut down, right? Like, March 13th, we came home and then we didn't go anywhere after that. Like the birthday party didn't happen. Our trip down to Champlain, New York to pick up our mail didn't happen. Like all this, like it was just immediate. And so all of a sudden people were in triage mode, like, okay, we got to get church planned through Easter. We have to get these things. Like, what do we do with, like, let's cancel school for a couple weeks and then we're going to get going. And it was just kind of like week to week. But we're in this phase where we're starting to shift, right? Like until we have a vaccine, and we don't know when that's going to be, or until the virus burns itself out, or until we have a treatment. And all of those are things that we don't know when that's going to be. So we're shifting from triage into more long-term kind of thinking. Like, how do we make this something that, like, what do we do? But none of us are especially trained to do this. So if it still feels like we're kind of like, the mental thing is like, okay, it's still triage, but we have to think more long-term. And so that's a little bit of a nice thing during summer youth ministry, when you can like do check-ins and stuff, but maybe programmatically. Like often summer is when like the big trips would happen, but those aren't happening now. And camp's not happening now, and BBS isn't happening now. And so, you're trying to think about that, but it's also when a lot of programmatic planning happens. And so this is the time to think about, okay, well, how do we do community building. So there's a group. So I've done a lot of dialogue work. So how to do dialogues with the public about, lots of different topics, everything from like alchemy to race in America. And there are lots of different groups that I've been trained as a facilitator in, and one is called Narrative 4. And there's a thing called Story Share, where you basically you share one another's stories to connect to community. That's totally something that you can do on Zoom, right? Like, and it's a huge community building piece. And it's something that can happen digitally. It helps for it to be in person, but it doesn't have to be. Like, this is the thing that you can do in a digital way. So you can't do like Trust Falls, and you can't do all of those like fun team building games that we all either love or hate or love to hate. You can't do all of those in person, but you can do different things. Like, you can connect with one another's stories. You can, send youth on, like, have them team up and do digital scavenger hunts or whatever, where each team has to find this thing in their neighborhood and they come together and put this together. Like, I think it just takes a little bit of thinking outside of the box, but again, going back to that principle, right? Like, if we want to get these youth to a place where they can speak comfortably with one another about the world around them and through the lens of their faith, right? Then we have to build community. And what do we want to do when we build community, right? We want people to trust one another. We want people to be able to accept one another, right? To love one another. This is what makes Christian community so different from like a group of school friends, right? Like, we're called to love one another as siblings in Christ. And so, okay, if that's our going principle, then what are the things that we can do to make that happen in a digital fashion or in super small group fashion? Like, and just being flexible and on our toes about when the requirements change. So it could be like in August that you can do this like drive-in movie night with your youth group and then talk about it. Like, I love the movie Saved, for example. I don't know if y'all have seen that. It came out in the early 2000s, I think. It has Macaulay Culkin in it, which was like the funny thing. And, as I said, I grew up in the Bible Belt, so it has special resonance for me. But it's a great movie about somebody like these teens kind of grappling with their faith and what it means. And you get one character like say, the Bible is not a weapon. It's after a Bible's been thrown after her. And like, you can watch this movie together in your drive-in and then talk about it. Like, what did you think about that? And it doesn't always have to be like, what did you think about that? What does Jesus tell you to think about this? But just like, how can we as the church like engage with this? And, if we firmly believe the youth of the church now and not the youth of the future, then that question is an important one to be asking them and to getting their input on. So it could be in the fall, you can do some like in-person small groupy stuff and establish that community so that if a second wave does show up like later in the fall, when we've all got to kind of go back home, that you have some sort of foundation built. So yeah, it's just like first principles, build from there. It's a long way of saying that, I suppose.
And the movie's called Saved?
Yeah, SAVED !
Okay, cool. I like that you also reminded us, and that was sort of part of my logic for why we're doing this in June, is like now is the time as we're about to, to start doing the programming and thinking about for September, even though we're all really tired. It's hard to dream right now, but that is definitely the timing piece is there.
And I think having like different streams. So originally when I was planning for my fall classes, I thought I was going to have to plan like, because we didn't know yet if we were going to be online or not, I was going to have a like in-person syllabus, online syllabus, and a hybrid. So like for each week, thankfully they said we were going to be online, so I can just plan for it. But I think you can do that. And when you're thinking about your fall events, like, okay, what are my in-person options these weeks? What are my online options? So if you're thinking about that kind of stuff now, then you don't have to go back into triage mode if we are all asked to isolate again, that you've already got stuff together, and that you can just keep going on that momentum. It takes a lot more work on the front end. That's the important thing to like, remember to take Sabbath, right? Like take digital Sabbath if you need, take some time off this summer, because I think we're going to be seeing church leader burnout in ways that we haven't before. Because like, I know so many clergy who are like, I can't take time off this summer because I'm the one that has to put together all the online stuff. And I'm like, guys, there are 5 million online services. Send your church to another church that Sunday. Like, get the Zoom link and send them there. It will be fine. Like, you have to take time off. So like take that time away and then come back and approach that, because it's not going to help our young people for us to be burnt out when they really need us to help walk through this. And it could be the time, if you have a lot of young people who are graduating from high school and who are going to be stuck at home, to think about like, what can you do to connect with those because they're those young people, because they're not really in your youth group anymore, but they're going to be in that weird liminal space. So this could be the opportunity to try and create something for them, just to keep them connected to one another, because I think they're a group that's going to be really struggling come the fall, when things are just, who knows what they are. They're weird.
Amen to that. Donna, you had a question or comment.
So I was just going to make a comment when you were talking about teenagers hugging and piling and all that kind of thing. I had a Zoom call, a group Zoom call with one of the directors of mental health from Princeton Theology. And she was saying that when you know a person and you know them to be in 3 dimensions, to sit on a Zoom call and speak with them in 2 dimensions, your brain goes into the mode of struggle. Your brain's trying to change them into 3 dimensions. So you don't know that's happening. It happens just without us realizing it. And so that's why Zoom calls for kids and for us becomes really exhausting, because your brain's busy trying to make everybody 3 dimensions when you already know them in 3 dimensions, right? Yeah. And so for that break, I'm hoping for that break for kids even, so they can actually, as you say, hug, do whatever they need to do, just to give them that space to feel good about themselves again before a second wave could hit and we're back into this again.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like one of the things that I think has gotten there, we've especially seen people who work with children and youth pushing back against, is that so much of the conversation about our response to this has centered solely on COVID and like the risks of that, and that it's a balance of risk to reward. So, everybody, like when daycares open back up, so many of my friends and I that have young kids, like in the US and here, are talking to each other about, how do we make this decision? What's the balance between like the physical risks of my child or one of us catching it versus the real like mental and emotional damage that's happening to him from being at home when he needs to be with his friends and at school and interacting with those kids, and not, with 2 parents who are working full time at home and also because like that's a system that is not set up that way. And so, it was like, even it's the lifeguards, right? The Quebec Lifeguard Association saying like, look, if we don't open the pools this summer, we're going to see an increase in drownings in lakes and rivers because people are hot and they're going to go swimming in these places that are not guarded. So what's the balance? What's the risk reward? And so I think this is something that youth ministers are especially attuned to, right? Like, how do we balance that risk and reward, and constantly reminding people too that like, this is trauma. Like we're going through a collective societal trauma, and there are different aspects to this. And how do we help our young people through it? How do we walk through this with them while we're experiencing it too in our own kind of weird ways? And so it's just like, that break would be so good.
But I also love your idea of getting together in whatever size group we're allowed, 6 feet apart, in a park or on the grass at the church, because we can't get in the church right now. And but being able to even see one another, and they can see each other in 3 dimensions. Like I've given them all mental health projects, and one of them is invite a friend over, have them sit 6 feet away, set up the chair, invite them over, tell them to bring their drink, just so they can actually see one of their friends in 3 dimensions. And I said to them, you can't understand how good for your mental health that is going to be. But maybe even me taking on the job of, okay, inviting the 6 that come on to Zoom every single week. Okay, you know what? Let's meet on the church lawn. I'll get there. I'll set the chairs up. Everybody come sit on a chair, bring your water. Let's have a chat. I think that's a wonderful idea. Thank you.
And our young people are capable of doing that, right? Like, I mean, when Quebec told us we could have 3 families, like of 10 people or fewer total, as long as everybody stays, 2 meters apart, I'm like, well, that just excluded everyone with a small child, because like, there's no way little kids know that. And thankfully at daycare, like they've just said, no, we were told we don't have to keep that rule because it's not good for little kids to stay apart from each other like that. And they also just don't know how. But young people do, right? Like, you know, you can get even like 10-year-olds, even 8-year-olds say like, okay, you're all going to do this. And like, what can we do? And there are lots of games you can play, right? That you can do at a distance. There's a great one with, where if you have a bigger group, you have a like roll of like twine, and you grab it and then you throw it across, and it creates a net, and you like try to like toss balls and do things like that. Like so many games you can do that are distant like that. You can have fun together. You can break bread together, right? I mean, there's so much that can happen because you do have this group of young people who are like, that's the adult part of the liminal thing. Like they can follow those directions. They can stay distant, but that the in-person part is going to be so life-giving for everybody. Just being able to see them and acknowledge that.
Thank you for the comment, and thank you for the response. Madden, would you kindly read Fresia's comment?
Sure. So she says, in my case, I am having a hard time because families are very conservative, and our 14-year-old do not have mobile phones, no Facebook or social media life. And if we want to meet, then families are present because they are using their parents' devices. When we start thinking long-term, what would you suggest?
Well, I think, I think in the first place, like we should all assume that we have some youth like that in our parish, right? Like, I mean, personally, I don't want my kid to have a smartphone when they're 14 because I know him, and I'm just like, and you know, it's one of those things that not every youth in our parish is of a same kind of like family with the same values or the same economic status, right? They may be in one where it's, where they say, no, you're not going to like have a Facebook account at 14 because that's just toxic. So we should always assume we at least have one youth like that. I think this is where trying to figure out how we can do in-person stuff is going to become important. But also, like, what can you do that families can be, like, if they're using their parents' devices? I mean, and this goes for even kids at home. Like, you should always assume that parents are going to be around and that they're not there. So, you know, you might not be able to get the same kinds of conversations with them that you would in person, but you can still talk about what's going on. You can say, like, you know, how's everybody feeling about, you know, what the plans for school are for the fall, or how's everybody feeling about what you've been reading in the news lately? Like, you can still talk about those things. Chances are, like, they may not be quite as free with them as if you all were sitting in a circle in the youth room or sitting out on a lawn when their parents aren't there. But I think that's also true for kids who are using their own devices. Who are probably doing that, you know, maybe from their bedroom or from their parents' room. And you know, parents technically really should be a little more aware of what their kids are doing online anyway. So I think that's just a good starting principle for safe internet usage, is like assume families are listening and that they're there. But in terms of, like, you know, there are parishes in the Diocese of Montreal, and I'm sure in others, where, like, generally people don't have good internet access and there aren't a lot of smartphones around. And so then I think it really is thinking creatively about what are the current rules about in-person gatherings, and how can we work with those. And if you have, you know, assistant youth leaders, you could maybe, if you had to, think, okay, like, what if we had a group of, you know, a youth leader and two families gather in one spot, and another youth leader and two families and another youth leader and two families and another. And then you just need like 3 iPads, right? Or 3 computers, and you're able to connect with one another that way. So, you know, think about, like, what are your resources? How can I work with the existing rules? And then just get creative about it. And think, okay, you know, we have this many kids and they're in this many families, and how can I split them into these groups and, you know, overcome kind of those tech challenges and do that in some ways. So, I mean, I don't think there are easy answers to it, and there's always going to be some complicating factor. But that's my initial thought about it.
Yeah, we spoke a little bit about pitfalls in the first meeting, and one of the pitfalls certainly was, like, you know, there's a lot of privilege associated with these types of interactions. Like we assume that everybody has access and has a device. No, not the case. So that's definitely like a concern for us as Christians. Like when people were only on here and we're saying, oh, you can only, be a part of this ministry if you have a thing. That's definitely a problem for us, and not one that we identified as a problem without a solution, other than, especially when we couldn't see any people, there's something we could do, and that was terrible. But now that we're moving into a new way of engagement, we have a little bit more opportunity around that.
When I think also this is a chance to remember our own teenagerhood when we had a family cell phone, but that was when roaming was still a thing. So it was really only if you were going on like a car trip on your own. So like it was kind of the beginning. I'm in that, like, millennials are in this weird situation of we're not really digital natives, but we're like first generation immigrant digital kids. So like we can do the translation work in ways better than like my parents can, for example. And so like I think back to my youth and was like, okay, how would we have connected with one another? And what ways can we think about that? Like we talked on the phone a lot, we were in person a lot, but we also did things like, I remember one summer when my high school boyfriend and I weren't going to be able to see each other much because I worked at camp and he was off at some summer program. And so we had this notebook, and like one week I would have the notebook and I would write stuff in it and like put pictures and like just kind of random stuff. And then he would have it the next week and he would write it, and then I would have it the next week. And so like, can you do things like that with your youth group, right? Like have a summer notebook, like where you're like, okay, you get it this week, and I want you to just like, let's introduce our youth to the analog era. Like here's this disposable cameras still exist, weirdly enough. So like give each of your youth a disposable camera and say like, all right, you're like, take this for the week, and I want you to just record take pictures of what's going on. And you can like pass around the notebook and like, or a book. You could pick a book and say like, all right, you get it this week. I want you to like, you're going to use the blue pen or whatever. And you just like read this and, make comments about it. And then somebody else gets it the next week and they read it and and like, there are ways to keep in touch with each other that are not digital. And I think the digital age has made us forget that and made us like really rely on it, because in some ways it's great, right? Like we're able to connect with each other face to face in ways we weren't before. But that also makes us forget that not everybody is able to, and also that we figured out ways to connect with one another before the digital age existed. And so how can we do those? And like for the young people, it could also be like, well, this is kind of corny, but it's also like, I don't know about you, but usually when I'm working with youth, if they see something's corny, they're often going to find it to be kind of fun too, because they're like, what is this digital camera? What do I do with this? You want me to write something down, not put it in a notebook? Like, cut pictures from magazines? What even is that? I haven't done that since kindergarten. Right? But like, think about how did you connect with your friends? If this had happened to you in high school, how would you have connected with your friends? And how can you incorporate some of that into your ministry now? Like, what are things that you can do to connect them? And so I think it's just kind of like, play the imagination game. Think about it. Like, what are fun things that your young people can do that can happen, that don't rely on smartphones or on iPads or on people having access in ways that they might not.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And also just Freezy, I'd like to respond to you a little bit as well, because we also talked about the concerns about having parents present and how that does sort of, you create a culture when you're an educator or a leader with your community of young people without their parents that's very unique. And with the parents present, it changes the dynamic entirely. And that's something that also we've been lamenting. Like, you're trying to have an intimate moment where they might even want to say like things aren't going well at home and they don't have the safety to do that. So that's another one of those concerns that we have to just name as one of the pitfalls of digital ministry, that we don't have that safety. So we need to create opportunities for kids to reach out to me by, if you can, if you're using digital, you can speak to me by email, write me a message, text me if you need to talk to me, because we just don't have the luxury of being in person, be able to have that safe space, because their parents are always looming, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad.
Yeah, it makes it really hard.
Yeah.
And I think for, like I said, for LGBTQ young people, it's particularly challenging. So, if you have young people in that situation, just to like be on top of that. And if you're not clergy, to connect with your parish clergy about that, just to bring them in and say, like, this is a pastoral situation that we just need to be aware of. Like, you should be aware of it anyway, but like now these young people, like, if they were out at church and they're not out at home, now they're not out anywhere really. So like just being aware of that ongoing trauma for them and how we help them navigate that.
That was such a great point, Hilary, about just imagining that situation. That was very traumatizing for me to think about. So thanks for bringing that to our attention.
Thanks, Donna. It was nice to meet you.
So glad to meet you. Thank you for coming. So Madden also had to pop off the meeting, but I do want to just create a little bit of an opportunity now for any kind of final words, dialogue. You are all welcome to make any comments. I do have one more question also for Hilary, if you'll bear with me for one more question for Hilary. Okay, great. I'll ask my final question. Think about your final thoughts as well. So what are your hopes for the future of this conversation? I mean, we've addressed that already. We know the church was in peril prior to this pandemic. We have these statistics around 2040, no more Anglicanism, whatever it is. And we know that membership is declining. That's just the reality of what we're working with. So what do you think, Hilary? What are your hopes? How can we be transformed by this experience?
So this, I don't know if this will be super shocking to say, especially coming from a priest who works in an Anglican seminary, but like, I hear those statistics and like, they don't bother me at all. Like, my faith is grounded in Christ's church, not the Anglican church. I was baptized a Christian, not an Episcopalian, not an Anglican. And so one of the dean of my seminary said to us at one point, he said, he heard this from the dean of Canterbury Cathedral when he was there. And he said, schism may rock the church and the church may decline and, Anglicanism may not exist anymore, but Christ Church, right? The big C church is always going to be okay. It's always going to be there. And that's been really important for me because I think it's easy for us to get caught up in the decline narrative and to wring our hands about it when really it's like, I anticipate still being Anglican in 2040 and my family is Anglican. So I guess maybe we don't count in that particular thing or they don't count on us being around. So, so my hopes don't really revolve around, like, I'd love for Anglicanism to keep going. I think it's important. It has something key to say for the future of the church, but I'm not invested in like giving everything to make sure that keeps going. I'm invested in making sure that the love of Christ is known in the world and known amongst our young people. And that's really the call, right? Like that's really what we're called to do as Christians, is to share Christ's love and to share that gospel. And so I guess my hope coming out of all of this is that for people who are going to church, who are in the church, that they will have recognized the importance of it to their lives. And that, once we're allowed to go out again and be in the world again, that the passion for the gospel will really kind of light up in those in-person things. And that when we gather once more, it won't just be this kind of like family reunion, but it will be an opening of our arms to gather in more. I mean, there are so many communities where they say, my church, we've had like all these new people show up to our online service that just like have never come before. And so when it comes to in-person, like when we're allowed to be in person again, my hope and my dream is not that those people don't show up, but that we welcome them in as well. And that we have a new understanding of the importance of the church in our lives, and not just the small C like Anglican church, but the big C church. And that we can articulate that to others and we can bring them in, and that we can help our young people see that as well, right? Like when I think about youth ministry, that we're going to have this group of young people who realize like, oh, right, church is like, it's not just this thing that my parents make me go to, but that it actually has a really important role to play, and that it can do some good. And so how do I do that? So yeah, that's my hope and my dream there. It's great if Anglicanism keeps going, but it's not the end of the world if it doesn't.
I love it. I love that. You honestly, you've been a wealth of information. I hope that you will agree to collaborate with me again in some way, that we can have similar conversations, and invite you all to continue this conversation. Are there any final remarks from anybody? Is there anything on your hearts you'd like to share? You can write them in the chat or say them aloud. Yeah, Stephen.
Unmute myself. Last time I mentioned about one of my struggles as a priest is finding relevant materials for the kids. And one of the things I lament is that the Anglican Church of Canada hasn't provided enough resourcing for children and youth ministry. And I'm specifically thinking of our Life in the Eucharist thing. If you notice in here, Life in the Eucharist, this was published in 1986. And then this is the only thing available. So Deborah Noonan last time mentioned another resource. Hang on now. And so this is the one that she sent me online. It's a program for First Communion or communion instruction for kids.
Yep.
So I've ordered it, and I'm gonna try to see how that goes for planning something for the fall. Just one of the things, like I know some evangelical churches spend a lot of money and put a lot of attention and priority into children's ministry. I wish that there'd be the same kind of intention across the Anglican Church of Canada with programming, with creating resources online. You go online to the Anglican Church of Canada, there's very little online for youth and children. You go to the Anglican Journal, there's nothing in there for youth and children. It would be lovely if there was something. We wonder why we're declining. We wonder why.
So
That's what I gotta say.
I found this to a certain extent, I found this even to be the case in the Episcopal Church. Like for communion instruction, also check out the Diocese of Texas, where Andy, I can't think of his last name, is the bishop. He has a really good first communion instruction manual as well. I'll try and locate it and send it to you, because like I'm in that weird position of like, as Anglicans, First Communion in a lot of ways doesn't make sense, because it's kind of like once you're baptized, you're here. But we are a tradition that have a lot of Roman Catholics who join. And so in my last parish, we were in this odd position of being like, well, this isn't really something that like theologically makes sense to us, but they really wanted it. And so their instruction does a really good job of walking that line about this isn't First Communion. It's just kind of communion instruction for kids. So what I often found was like, and this is like, the Episcopal Church is a lot bigger, has a lot more resources, and there's a lot of stuff for youth, but it's often, I found what was most helpful was, like I was just most people would do J2A, which I have a deep love for Journey to Adulthood, and the Right 13 program needs rewriting. And I think they're working on that because it's very gender specific about like man, woman. And so they're trying to,
yes.
but the Journey to Adulthood program was going when I was in high school. It was before I was in high school. It's still really strong. So a lot of people would rely on that. I would often use, like the Presbyterian Church, like Spark House.
Yeah, that's good.
Their Ancestors series is so good. And and I love it and just recommend it all the time. And so I often just have to go outside of Anglicanism to find the stuff that I want, because it's just not like church publishing doesn't, I think, focus on that quite as much. And so I would some of the resources that are there. And I don't know if you're a member of Forma, which is, so in the Episcopal Church, there's an organization called Forma. I'll write it in here, that is focused on Christian formation. And it's not just kids and youth, but it tends to, I think, focus on that. They have a really big Facebook page that does stuff, and it's not limited to it. Like there are lots of Canadians who go to Forma and who engage with it, but you can find lots and lots of resources through that organization, and who will help make that connection. I don't know the youth resources in Canada quite as much because I haven't been doing youth ministry in Canada. And like Clay got canceled this summer. I think they're going to try and do it next summer. But I would also, it's next summer. Is it still going to be in Calgary, I think? Yeah. Okay. And so, but I would often find myself trolling like other mainline Protestant denomination, because the thing that always got pointed out was like, well, you can use, what's the name of it? There's that one lectionary based curriculum that we used when I was in high school, and it was kind of not great then. That still gets used a lot. And I said, well, we don't always have to do the lectionary. Young people are capable of hearing like,
oh, the whole people of God? Is it
No,
that one?
that's
No,
not
that
one.
was an Anglican one. Yeah.
I can't remember what it is, but it's still around. Living the Good News. No, maybe it's Living the Good News. I don't know. But there was like one that everybody used. And so, just, I look around, and you can even take one year, my growing up, we used a vacation Bible school curriculum throughout the whole year. Like you can do that. You can get a VBS curriculum that you like, and spread that out over, a whole semester, basically. So, but yeah, I do think there's a lack of resources. There's a lack of resources, and there's a lack of that kind of thing. And I think yes, it's affirmation, Stephen. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, me too. So I would check out Forma though. And you can, I don't know how much it costs to become a member of the organization, but I think you can just join the Facebook page for free.
I reached out on your behalf, Stephen, to the National Church to ask about resources and maybe
Thank you.
another conversation. And so I've opened that door, and I haven't really gotten any response yet, but I have a relationship with the person who does youth ministry for the National Church. So I'll definitely.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, because I think it's.
This is all we have.
It's very sad. Very sad.
Yeah, let me see if I can find the Texas thing for you, because it's coming from somebody who doesn't really do First Communion stuff. I found it good.
I was never really a user of pre-existing programs. I was definitely somebody who would go on to Pinterest, just use the internet in general, and draw resources based on the needs of my group every week, which is probably in the end much more labor intensive, but I feel like it was much more responsive to the people that I serve. So there's also that option of just feeling into the community, what their needs are, and using Pinterest or any kind of Google search to get some great stuff.
Yeah, I think it's just I'm totally a use the work of other people person. I'm going to use the curriculum and work with it, but I know lots of churches where they do the opposite, and you can also do both. And you can do current events versus this other thing. And I put the link to that Eucharist instruction in the chat. So and on the right, when you go to that page, on the right side, you'll see a whole thing. Now it's based on the prayer book for the Episcopal Church. So, you might want to use what is it? BAS Prayer 3 is the one based on, there are a couple in the BAS that are based on the 79. So that might help that translation better there. But the
Thank you.
he writes is good.
Another program was Teens Encounter Christ, which I think was a teen version of Curcio, which was engagement.
Big in Minnesota.
It could be, but my concern is it tends to be very evangelical, and some of it's fundamentalist, and I always have to amend it to make it inclusive and even around what Deborah had mentioned last week was when we understand Jesus's death and resurrection. Is it how do we interpret the mysteries of the faith? Now, an evangelical is going to have a different spin on that. And see, a lot of Anglican churches I know turn to evangelical materials. I've seen something in the shelf here. I've inherited. I've only been here 4 months. I'm from Massachusetts, actually, Hilary.
I was looking up and I was like, oh yeah, where are you? Where in Massachusetts?
Lunenburg.
Okay, I lived in Worcester for 11 years.
North of Worcester.
Yeah.
And so even here, there's some kind of evangelical program that was used in the church, I've realized, and it had this place to say the sinner's prayer and accept Jesus into your heart to be saved. Well, that's a different understanding of the faith that we would profess, and how we would introduce the mysteries of the faith and connect with God. And I always have to kind of amend these materials. And I just wish that there was something that would be specific. I know Living the Questions, that's a different version than Alpha. Alpha, I find, even though it's coming from an Anglican church in England, it's so fundamental. And so Living the Questions, there are some alternatives. but not enough for children and youth, I find.
Yeah, that's so Spark House is going to be a good one to start with, because that's put out by PCUSA, and it has a lot of Lutheran and some UMC materials.
And, Methodist, yeah.
Yeah, so you're going to find, I think, like, I really want to write them and say, hey, can I do an Anglican? They have like a confirmation curriculum for Methodists, Lutherans, and Presbyterians, but they don't have one for Anglicans. And I was like, can I write that? But if you're looking for a good confirmation curriculum, Confirm Not Conform is really, really solid. I put that in the thing too. I know the person who helped write it. There's a big confirmation project out of Virginia Theological Seminary, which is also a general resource that you should get to know really well, because their lifelong faith formation stuff is good. And Lisa Kimball is stellar. Like, she's just brilliant. And she really is passionate. She and her partner are very passionate about evangelism and sharing the gospel, and doing that within an Anglican context. But Confirm Not Conform is great because it's about confirmation that is confirming your faith and not conforming to some. It's like talking about the difference between the two. But there's an adult curriculum as well as a youth one, so you can run them simultaneously if you want. It's a curriculum that you could, I always encourage people, like, usually confirmation classes end up being 2 youth and a priest, and it's terrible. Because that's just not good for anyone. And so I encourage people to think like, okay, can you do a confirmation class with like a bunch of churches in your area? Can you do like a group one? And Confirm Not Conform works really well with that. And it also has a good development of a mentor thing, so that your sponsor is not just somebody who just kind of, and stands up there, but is somebody that you've actually done some work with. So yeah, that's a good one if you're looking for confirmation curriculum. So, but yeah, Spark House is my go-to for a lot of stuff, because it's good there. So,
can I jump in with 2 other resources? This is from the Rebuilt series. It's written by a Roman Catholic priest and a church administrator, but it's very good. And I find that it kind of bridges the gap. It's more sacramental, and it focuses more on the community of the church. It's not just this individual me and Jesus in the Bible. And they also have Rebuilding Confirmation, Rebuilding Youth Ministry. And it's a Rebuilt series. It's really good, I found. And especially trying to find something that's contextually relevant within a liturgical community. Yeah. So it's just another resource there. Thank you.
I mean, I think good confirmation programs are hard. My favorite thing in Confirm Not Conform is where you restage the Council of Nicaea with your class. And you go through you get them to encounter the creed in a new way. But anyway.
Well, I feel like we need to host another webinar that's all about confirmation, and maybe at some point we'll actually be able to gather in the same space and do it face to face as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you all so much. This has been, honestly, Hilary, this has been really, really useful. You're a wealth of information. I really appreciate you sharing with us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so.
Can't thank you enough, and I will be hitting you up again. And I'm the annoying one who's like, it's 11 o'clock at night. Hey, are we still on? You're like, yeah, it's about pestering me. But yes, I will definitely be getting back in touch with you, because this has been great. And I thank you all for, it's Friday morning, we're tired, but this is the chance for us to do some latent learning, put it all down, and let it all percolate, and wonder and dream and pray on what we can do in September to bring all this stuff to life, because there's no shortage of brilliant information that we got today. I'll put together a few notes. So how do we feel about me being able to share this webinar? It seems like nobody said anything too weird or incriminating today, so it looks like it could be okay. Are we all in favor of me sharing this webinar?
I'm okay with that, yeah.
Thank you so much. That'll make all of our lives easier. It's quite long. I don't know if anybody will get through the whole thing, but I'm certainly glad that I did. So, God bless you all, and thank you all.